Since COVID broke out, we've been hosting all these on Zoom lately, but it's nice to see everyone back in person here. Thank you everyone for wearing a mask. It is a city requirement, so I appreciate your cooperation with that. It enables us to be here in person, so I appreciate your cooperation with that. And I'd like to also welcome all of the folks. We are now filming all of our meetings and posting them to YouTube, and they'll be going on the local public broadcasting as well. So that's exciting, and we're very happy to be able to offer it to a wider audience in that way. So that way we kind of developed quite a following of people who are not locals, who are on the Zoom calls, so at least this way they can keep up with all of our presentations and all that, so that's good news as well. For those of you who are board members, we're up for our quarterly board meeting, so I'll be reaching out to each one of you about a February board meeting at some point, hopefully in the first or second week, probably the second week of February. But be on the lookout for an email about that. I also want to draw your attention to a partner program that we'll be hosting on Zoom with the Bedford Historical Society. Lee Blake from the New Bedford Historical Society reached out to Bob and I a few weeks ago. They're looking to host a program on William Jackson, who's a local African-American man who was involved in the Civil War. So the Historical Society is really taking that on. They asked if we would be partners in the presentation, so I said sure. It's Valerie Craigswell, and she is a descendant of Jackson. So she'll be speaking about her ancestors. So that should be a very interesting presentation. They're working on their promotional materials and all that, so be on the lookout for that in the next flag bearer, and we can send out an email about that as well. But that is Tuesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. that they're looking to host that, and again, that will be on Zoom. Tonight, we were supposed to have Patrick Donovan from the Farnham Military History Museum talking to us about their work with the Civil War stuff that they have and all that. Unfortunately, Patrick's, one of his close friends, passed away due to COVID-19, and as a result, we got a panicked email on Sunday saying that he could not present, and so you're all lucky enough or unlucky enough to be stuck with me for the next 30, 45 minutes. We'll see how long it lasts. We're going to be embarking on a different topic. I don't think I have given this presentation to this group yet. I've given other Gettysburg-related presentations, but I don't think I've given this particular one yet. So we're going to be taking a deep dive tonight into the resources. We're going to be having a very deep conversation, so buckle up. We're in for one heck of a ride in the next 30, 45 minutes together with this presentation tonight. I would hazard a guess that most of you, because you are here, have an interest in the Civil War and have heard of Stuart's ride at Gettysburg. Oftentimes, perhaps our views of Stuart's ride are tainted by the idea that you may get from the movie Gettysburg. How many people here have ever watched the movie Gettysburg before? Yeah, almost everybody in the room, I'm sure, has watched the movie Gettysburg. And the movie Gettysburg gives a very clear picture about Stuart's ride and how it should be viewed. How we should view the actions of this man, James Ewell Brown Stuart, and his actions in the Gettysburg campaign. What is the illustration that the movie gives us of Jeb Stuart's ride? Is it a positive or a negative thing? How is it depicted in the movie? Negative! Thanks, Don! Gold star for participation. It's depicted as a very negative thing. Stuart has messed up. He has made a poor decision. He has, dare I say, disobeyed his commanding general's orders. Lee uses those exact words in his discussion with Stuart in the movie. He has disobeyed his orders. This is a very popular perspective of the events of Stuart's ride, which unfurled in late June, early July of 1863 during the Gettysburg campaign. Tonight, though, we're going to question whether or not this is an accurate depiction. Is it possibly an accurate depiction? Maybe. but probably not an accurate depiction of the events of late June, early July of 1863. However, many historians, from the first generation of historians who wrote about the Gettysburg campaign, starting in about the 1880s, men who lived through the Gettysburg campaign, to later historians like Douglas Southall Freeman, more modern historians like Alan Weslow or Gary Gallagher, have depicted this ride of Stuarts during the Gettysburg campaign in a similar light. I want to make this clear at the outset of this presentation. This is not an attempt to vindicate a Confederate, his thoughts, or his perspectives. This is merely an attempt to come to a better understanding and perhaps to slightly alter the narrative to be more fair to an individual who could never defend himself. Jeb Stuart dies in 1864. All of the arguments and debates that happened in the post-war years about whether or not this was a joyride, he disobeyed orders, all that, he never had a chance to defend himself. He would have died long before, during the war itself. There is historical truth. We know Stuart's ride happened. We know Reconstruction happened. But I want to point out to you this idea of historiography, and the idea that historians craft a narrative around these historical events. And the ways in which those historians craft those narratives can dramatically affect the way in which we understand those historical events. History, as one of my favorite professors as an undergrad said, is an argumentative discourse. In that way, I am going to be presenting to you an argument tonight. An argument that the popular way of viewing Stuart's ride, and whether or not strictly the question of did he disobey his commander's orders, is flawed at best. And so the simple question that we seek to answer tonight is, was General Stuart authorized by his commanding general, Robert E. Lee, to complete this ride, or did he deliberately disobey his commander's orders? In order to get to the heart of this question, we have to investigate several important players in what unfurls in the years after the Civil War and in the century plus that has elapsed since then. The argument about Stuart's ride really comes down to two sects of people. Those who support Lee and those who supported Stuart. Those who supported Lee, many of them were members of the Lost Cause. Perhaps a few of you will think back, a little under a year ago, I was in sunny Florida on a temporary assignment for the National Park Service, and I presented to you from sunny Florida a presentation on the Lost Cause, and how in many ways, Lost Cause adherents, people like Jubal Early, I'll withhold my comments on Jubal Early, I'm not a fan, individuals like Jubal Early, who was a lawyer, was able to shape the narrative of the Civil War, and in many ways shape the way that we view a lot of historical events that happened during the war. Many of these individuals who supported Lee in this argument sought to glorify Robert E. Lee. Of course, there's a picture of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And other Confederate heroes as brilliant geniuses, the best and the brightest of the South, true gentlemen, and exceptional military officers. To this group, however, there is one major blemish on the record of Robert E. Lee. When you look at his career in the American Civil War, there is one clear blemish. Even later in the war, 1864, 1865, you can make an argument that, well, who really won the Battle of the Wilderness? Who won Spotsylvania? Cold Harbor. Lee, even though Grant is incurring further into the South, even though Grant is driving the South into the ground, Grant is still losing most of those conflicts to Lee. So, these adherers to the Lost Cause in the post-war years have a decent argument. Lee did not lose many battles on the field. He perhaps lost the strategic initiative of the war. He certainly did not win the war, but on battlefields, he oftentimes won. There is one major blemish to that record that is irrefutable. Even Antietam, although Jack will disagree with me, and probably rightly so, even Antietam you could say was a draw.
No.
I know, Jack, I know. There are historians who will argue that Antietam is a draw, though, getting back to our points of arguments. I tend to agree with you, Jack, that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. We'll put in a plug for the book later. One major blemish on his record, though, is Gettysburg, right? You cannot really refute that in the end, Lee lost the Battle of Gettysburg. So how do you come to terms with that? How did these individuals, these adherents to the lost cause, have to come to terms with that? They sought to vindicate Lee's actions at Gettysburg by blaming his subordinates, especially those subordinates who were seen as traitors or were not alive to defend themselves at the end of the war. Shouldn't surprise us that two of the biggest people who are blamed in all of this are who? Longstreet and Stuart. Longstreet, who after the war, good friends with Grant, becomes a Republican, becomes an ambassador under the Grant administration. Stuart, who is dead. Traitors or those who are dead. Certainly these subordinates shared the blame for his defeat. It's not to say that Longstreet is blameless at the Battle of Gettysburg. It's not to say that Jeb Stuart is blameless at the Battle of Gettysburg. But to argue that Lee himself was blameless during the entire campaign is, and frankly still was, and frankly still is ridiculous. They take this argument way too far. One of these individuals who is blamed for his actions at the Battle of Gettysburg is Jeb Stuart. Stuart's ride is seen as a glaring error, and Stuart is blamed for negligence, egotism, self-absorption, arrogance, and narcissism. Among some of the biggest arguers for Lee in the post-war years were those who were on Lee's staff. Two particular individuals, Walter Taylor and Charles Marshall, the two gentlemen you see here on the bottom, both members of Lee's staff, Walter Taylor and Charles Marshall. In the post-war years, it was these two more than any others that brought down scathing criticisms upon Stuart. When does the idea that Stuart deliberately disobeyed his orders first come about? It is not in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Reports after the battle, Lee's report itself does not bring down criticism of Stuart, does not say he disobeyed his orders. In fact, we'll look at Lee's after-action report in a little bit and how he handled the issues surrounding Stuart's ride. The first recorded event where Lee is clearly, and where Stuart is clearly and directly blamed for disobeying Robert E. Lee's orders is in 1887, nearly 25 years after the war had ended. Colonel Charles Marshall, Lee's military secretary, made a stunning revelation at that dinner party in 1887. He revealed that supposedly during the war, he wanted to try Stuart in a court-martial for his actions during the Gettysburg campaign. Marshall related, quote, "I dealt with Stuart in the plainest language. In fact, I had told him before that I thought he ought to be shot for his actions in the Gettysburg campaign. General Lee was unwilling, however, to adopt my draft. I had changed upon his explicit disobedience of orders and laid the full responsibility at his," referring to Stuart's, door, end quote. And so for the first time, 20 plus years after the war had ended, the first claim that Stuart had deliberately disobeyed his orders was made. This bandwagon is hopped on by others. Taylor, who was also a member of Lee's staff, Early, and other proponents of the lost cause mythology. They continued and built upon Marshall's criticism in the 1880s and 1890s. These criticisms were then joined were then taken on by major historians. Douglas Southall Freeman, the great writer of Lee's Lieutenants, that 3-volume study of all of Lee's subordinate officers and Lee himself. Gary Gallagher and James McPherson in more modern days. Alan Weslow, who holds the chair at Gettysburg College today, which is widely considered as one of the more prominent academic positions studying the Civil War, have all continued this line of thought, which first was developed in 1887. Then on the other side of this argument, we have those who supported Stuart. In retaliation for this, and other remarks that were written against Stuart, those who were closest to Stuart during the war struck back. Most prominent among these were Henry B. McClellan, Stuart's chief of staff, up in the top left portion of the slide there, and a man whose image is not on the slide, John Singleton Mosby, the Gray Ghost, as he was known. McClellan, Stuart's chief of staff, though, is going to be one of the most prominent people to argue on behalf of Stuart in the post-war years. He vehemently defended his commander in his autobiography/biography of Stuart called I Rode with Jeb Stuart. You can still get copies of it. You can read it yourself if you wish. His main claim was that Stuart was faultless and simply followed orders. Perhaps, almost certainly, McClellan takes it too far in the opposite direction, as often happens in disputes and arguments such as these. But later historians, including a former park ranger at Gettysburg, Mark Nesbitt, probably more well known for his Ghosts of Gettysburg series, I'll withhold my commentary on that, and others have championed Stuart's cause in more recent years. So what is the truth? We need to look at the historical evidence that we have in order to produce a case. A case which, hopefully rooted in those orders and those primary source documents, will help us to figure out what in fact happened. I think it's important, and we won't make a big deal of this, but when we talk about Stuart's ride, and here's a map of the Gettysburg campaign, so Lee's army is 3 corps making its way up the Shenandoah Valley, using the Blue Ridge Mountains to kind of screen their movements from the Union advance, all the way up into Pennsylvania, spreading out across southern Pennsylvania, Hooker's army following up through Maryland. Eventually, 3 days before the battle, it will go from Hooker's army to General George Gordon Meade's army. But at this point that we're talking about, still Joseph Hooker is still the commander of the Union Army. And this dotted line here, which is kind of difficult to see, unfortunately, the quality coming through ain't that great. But you can kind of see this dotted line here, and that is Stuart's ride itself. But it begs the question of why is Lee invading the North in the first place? This in and of itself is a whole discussion. This could be a 30, 45-hour-long presentation in and of itself. Different historians will argue different things. Usually, though, some of the main themes that come across and why Lee is invading the North are among these that are listed on the screen here. Win a decisive victory in the North. March on Washington, perhaps that'll end the war. Draw concentration, remember, the Confederate army under Pemberton is under siege in Vicksburg. Perhaps an attack in the North can draw some of Grant's troops away to go back and defend Washington, to loosen the grip on Vicksburg. The Pennsylvania governor at that time is a Republican. Perhaps by moving up into Pennsylvania, by inflicting damage in Pennsylvania, maybe they can swing the election, the gubernatorial election in Pennsylvania, and ultimately maybe that can swing the election in 1864. Resources, resources, resources. I put that in capital letters because I do not think that we can underestimate the importance of the need for resources for the Confederate Army in 1863.
From Europe or the
From the area that they're moving into. That's a great question. And to that point, right, the blockade by 1863 is actually what was relatively ineffective in 1861, 1862, is becoming more and more effective. And so the need for resources, such as foodstuffs, the stuff that people need to survive, the need for those kind of resources is vital. Think about where they're moving into. They're moving into south central Pennsylvania. In many ways, you drive through South Central Pennsylvania today, what do you see lining the highways still to this day? Farm after farm after farm. It's rich farmland. Good for raising cattle. At that point, good for wheat and other products. They're moving into that area for a reason. They need the supplies to feed an army. It's logistical in many ways. Final point I want to bring up to you, and I think that this is a critical point, and again, in and of itself, this is its own presentation. But the difference between was this an invasion or was this a foray in force, an incursion? There's a very real difference. Oftentimes, people use incursion and invasion interchangeably. I think we're learning in the situation in Ukraine right now that they could be very different things. But they are two very different words. An invasion is something that is happening that is expected to be holding in an enemy territory for some time. By invading into that territory, you are moving there to make some sort of gain, physical gain, that you will at least hold for some time. So an invasion could mean moving into South Central Pennsylvania and capturing Harrisburg or capturing Washington, D.C. You are invading to gain something and to hold it for some substantial amount of time, militarily speaking. An incursion, a foray in force, you may be moving into enemy territory, but it is not your expressed intent to stay in that enemy territory. You're going there to acquire resources, you're going there to acquire, perhaps to force your enemy into making a certain move, into drawing resources away from another theater in war. You're not going there with the strict intent of staying for any long period of time. I'm not here to tell you whether this was an invasion or an incursion, but I think that's an important thing that oftentimes is lost and is a critical aspect when we look at Stuart's ride. If this is an incursion and there is no real intent to stay, what Stuart does in the long run is much more valuable than, let's say, if this was intended to be an invasion that was going to stay in the country in the north for a long, extended period of time. I will not provide you with an answer to the question of invasion or incursion today, but I pose it as food for thought. One of the critical aspects that leads to a decision, I think, that Jeb Stuart makes is the Battle of Brandy Station, which happens on June 9, 1863. In a surprise attack, Union cavalry forces attack. They catch Stuart's troopers off guard. Although the Confederates were able to stave off defeat, there is some pretty nasty criticism that is levied against Stuart and his cavalry troopers. Cavalry. I can never do that. I always want to say cavalry. Cavalry troopers. In the papers. The Richmond Sentinel claimed after the June 9th battle, quote, "Vigilance, vigilance, more vigilance is the lesson to be taught us by the Brandy surprise, and which must not be forgotten by the victory which was wrested from defeat. Let all learn it from the Major General," that's referring to Stuart, "down to the picket," end quote. That appeared in the Richmond Sentinel on June 12, 1863. That same day in the Richmond Examiner, they blamed the surprise on, quote, "a few vain and weak-headed officers," end quote. Certainly Stuart was among those vain and weak-headed officers that the paper was attacking. Stuart's reaction to all of this. Writing to his wife, Flora, shortly thereafter these reports appeared in the paper, he stated, quote, "The newspapers are false in every statement except as to victory. The papers ought to apologize," end quote. Later in the letter he continued, "I will, of course, take no notice of such base falsehoods," end quote. Saying that the news is lying. Fake news. As Stuart biographer Jeffrey D. Wirt asserts, quote, "The tone of his letters to Flora indicated anger and resentment," you don't say, "of the press's treatment of him. Even the Federals, who had read the Southern newspaper, expected Stuart to do something to retrieve his reputation," end quote. Stuart was initially ordered by Lee to screen the Confederate Army as they moved up through the Blue Ridge Mountains and into the Shenandoah Valley. I bring to your attention, the events of Brandy Station. Because I think it is undeniable that these play into the decisions that Stuart will make. The proposition that he is about to present forth to Robert E. Lee on June 18th is in many ways, I think, affected by his defeat at Brandy Station. Stuart was a lot of things, but he did have a penchant to take offense to things that were written about him in the paper. He liked the notoriety. He liked the notoriety when it was positive. When it was negative, it oftentimes would affect his decisions. So again, if we're trying to present a fair analysis of these events that incur, no doubt Stuart is affected by what happens on June 9th at Brandy Station. It is shortly thereafter, this battle at Brandy Station, that Stuart conceives of a plan to ride around the Union Army. Sometime after the Battle of Brandy Station on June 9th and prior to June 18th. He had done this twice before, and both times they were masterful successes. He rides around, circumvents McClellan's army on the peninsula in June of 1862, and he does the same thing in the Antietam campaign a few months later in September of 1862. And he is proposing a very similar ride as to both of those, which he had great success at. Although the exact date and location of this meeting are not known, there is record and report of a meeting between Generals Lee, Longstreet, and Stuart. This meeting between Lee, Longstreet, and Stuart happening on or around June 18th. Supposedly, at this meeting, Stuart presents his plan. We have few records of this meeting, some from Lee's staffers, Marshall being one of them who leaves us a report of this meeting. One of Longstreet's staffers, Moxley Sorrell, also leaves a report of this meeting between Lee, Longstreet, and McClellan of Stuart's staff leave us a report of this meeting. So between the three, all three of them from all three different staffs writing about it in the time, we know this meeting happened. The problem is they differ on when it happened, whether it happened on the night of June 17th, early in the morning on June 18th. Suffice it to say it happened sometime probably when it was dark outside between June 17th and June 18th. The exact time, not exactly known. Lee's official report of the campaign seems to indicate that he supports the proposition that his subordinate made. In Lee's official report of the campaign, he writes this, quote, "Upon the suggestion of the former officer," referring to Stuart, "that he could damage the enemy and delay his passage of the river by getting in his rear, he was authorized to do so, and it was left to his discretion whether to enter Maryland east or west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But he was instructed to lose no time in placing his command on the right of our column as soon as he should perceive the enemy moving forward." A few points here that I have highlighted and underlined. By getting in his rear, he was authorized to do so. So basically, here, Lee is saying that Stuart is proposing a ride around the Union Army. He wants to circumvent the Union Army as it's moving north. He wants to get into their rear and cause a lot of damage. He was authorized to do so, left to his discretion. Here again, we see Lee giving his subordinates discretion. A little bit later in the campaign, everybody loves, if practicable, with Richard Ewell, the discretion that was given to Ewell. Lee is giving his subordinate discretion to decide whether or not he can attempt this. The other important point here is to lose no time. To lose no time. Lee wants this to be something that happens rapidly. And in fact, Stuart's other successful rides all happened rapidly. They did not take it did not take a prolonged time to successfully circumvent the Union Army in either the Peninsular Campaign or in the Antietam Campaign. It happens relatively quickly. Lee wants this to happen relatively quickly. The other point I want to call to your attention is where he is to cross into the north, where he is to cross the river, whether it's east or west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, this is important to consider because almost every single road in the Shenandoah Valley, west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, is occupied by who? The Confederate infantry, all the wagons, and all their supplies. East of the Blue Ridge Mountains, if he is to cross east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, who is occupying almost all the roads east of the Blue Ridge Mountains? The Union Army, and all their wagon trains and infantry and cavalry. If he is to cross east of the mountains, that means that by the road systems that are available to him, he has to completely circumvent the Union Army. So Lee's basically saying, I want you to get into the rear of the Union Army, and then, once you get into the rear and you start to cause havoc, I leave it to your discretion whether or not you think you can circumvent them, get around them, and back up to our right, as Richard Ewell is now passing up into Pennsylvania and starting to spread out across southern Pennsylvania. I leave it to your discretion whether or not you think you can get around them, or if you have to come back to this side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. That is to your discretion. Lee follows up his supposed verbal order. Oh, it would have been nice to have a map instead of me just flailing my arms around, huh? I think that this does a pretty good job, though, right? You see the Blue Ridge Mountains here. Lee's Confederate Army moving up west of those Blue Ridge Mountains, occupying almost every single road that ran in that direction, as is the Union Army over here. So if Stuart's going to get into the rear of the Union Army, and he's going to pass east of the mountains, he almost has to go further east and circumvent the Union Army. And ideally, somewhere up in southern Pennsylvania, northern Maryland, link back to the Confederate forces there. Lee follows this verbal order with a written order on June 22nd. Lee says this, quote, I judge the efforts of the enemy yesterday were to arrest our progress and ascertain our whereabouts. Things have happened now. Union cavalry are trying to incur through the Blue Ridge Mountains. They're trying to see what the Confederates are up to, right? They're using that mountain range as a screen. They're trying to come through the Union forces and see what those Confederates are up to. So that's what Lee's writing about. They're trying to ascertain our progress and whereabouts. Perhaps he is satisfied. Do you know where he is and what he is? Oh, that was interesting. Do you know where he is and what he is doing? I fear he will steal a march on us and get across the Potomac before we are aware. Lee already on June 22nd is suspecting that the Union Army is moving faster than he had anticipated them to move. The idea that Lee is caught totally off guard on July 1st, on June 2nd, a week before, he's already starting to realize that the Union Army is moving faster than he expects them to move. If you find that he is moving northward, and that two cavalry brigades, can guard the Blue Ridge Mountains and take care of your rear, you can move with the three other brigades into Maryland and take position on Ewell's right flank. Place yourself in communication with him, guard his flank, keep him informed of the enemy's movements, and collect all the supplies you can for the use of the army. One column of General Ewell's army will probably move toward the Susquehanna by the Emmitsburg route, another by the Chambersburg route, end quote. Lee is telling Stuart where to look for Ewell's right flank. Where is he looking for Ewell's right flank? In Pennsylvania already. So he's basically saying, if you can get around him, if you can move around their enemy and seek out Ewell's right flank somewhere in the area of the Susquehanna, Emmitsburg, in that area, more or less in the area of Gettysburg that we would know today, right? You are authorized to do so if you think you can steal the march on him, if you think you can get around him quickly enough. This order is going to, another point here. We notice how Lee is talking about 2 brigades and 3 brigades. How many brigades of cavalry does Stuart have under his control during the Gettysburg campaign? 7. He has 7 brigades under his control. We oftentimes only think about the 3 that he took with him, but where are the other 4 brigades throughout the entire Gettysburg campaign with Lee's army? 2 of them guarding the Blue Ridge Mountains. 1 of them Imboden's cavalry is up in advance of the Confederate army. The assertion that Lee was without cavalry at the Battle of Gettysburg is hogwash. He had cavalry. They may not have been where he wanted them to be when the battle breaks out, but he has cavalry under his direct command and authority. Jeb Stuart, though, is not there. And I think that that gets to a bigger point that we'll get to later. Stuart is not with Lee at Gettysburg. Not to say that he's without cavalry, he's without Stuart at Gettysburg. Longstreet is going to forward Stuart this first order on June 22nd, and Longstreet's going to add an addendum to this order. Longstreet says this, quote, "I think that if you can move across the Potomac without disclosing our plans, he speaks of you leaving via Hopewell Gap and passing by the rear of the enemy, if you can get through by that route." Longstreet also sent a letter to Lee stating, quote, "I have forwarded your letter to General Stuart with the suggestion that he pass by the enemy's rear if he thinks that he may get through." Pass by the enemy's rear. Pass by the enemy's rear, meaning he's going to go right around the enemy and up the other side, circumventing him. Everything within this first order and Longstreet's addendum to the order is well within the purview, well within the discretion that Lee is giving to Stuart to make this move. Lee's going to follow up his first order on June 23rd with a second order. I think that Lee perhaps sensed that there may have been some uncertainty in the way that he wrote his first order. He wanted to clear up some of the murkiness in the first order. So he wrote this, quote, "If General Hooker's army remains inactive, you can leave 2 brigades to watch him and withdraw with the other 3. But should he not appear to be moving northward, I think you had better withdraw this side of the mountain tomorrow night and cross at Shepherdstown the next day and move to Fredericktown." So basically Lee is saying, you have to look to Hooker's army. If Hooker's army is moving, I don't want you circumventing him. I don't want you trying to get around his rear. I want you coming back west of the mountains and coming up. But if he is stationary on the next day, then you can move around and circumvent the army. He follows with this. "You will, however, be able to judge whether you can pass around their army without hindrance, doing them all the damage you can, and cross the river east of the mountains. In either case, after crossing the river, you must move on and feel the right of Ewell's troops collecting information, provisions, etc." That second part of that gives Stuart once again what? Discretion. Discretion to do what he thinks would be the best thing in the situation. These 2 orders mean one thing. Lee gives Stuart total discretion to make the decision that he made. At this point, Stuart had only received orders from both Lee and Longstreet which suggested, some would argue firmly suggested, I won't take it that far, but suggested that Stuart should do as he proposed and ride around the enemy if it was possible to do so. Now Stuart would have to simply wait for information from his scouts to decide whether or not this was indeed possible. One of these proposals seems to be to swing around the Union Army just as Stuart did if the Union Army was not in motion. As Stuart initiates this plan on June 23rd and 24th of 1863, to Stuart, the Union Army appeared inactive that day, at least to his perception, and that led him to the decision to ride around the Union Army. Then we get to a supposed third order. Now, McClellan, Stuart's chief of staff, is going to make the assertion that on that night of June 23rd into the 24th, a third order will arrive from Robert E. Lee to Stuart about what he is to do. That night was recorded as a dismal and soggy one. Rain fell in torrents. Stuart opted out of staying in a civilian's home, and he slept underneath a tree wrapped in his blanket. It was during this night that Stuart's adjutant, McClellan, claimed to have received a third order from Lee. McClellan claimed this order suggested that infantry, artillery, and wagon trains clog the roads running northward in the Shenandoah Valley. Should Stuart decide to cross into Maryland on the west side of the mountains, and stay with the main body, he would be forced to wait until the roads cleared, thus delaying his advance. Whether or not this document is true, whether or not it actually existed, doesn't really matter, because that statement is true. The roads were clogged. Whether or not Lee is writing an order to Stuart saying that the roads are clogged is a different issue. But certainly the roads were clogged west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It would have been very difficult for Stuart's cavalry to move up through the Shenandoah Valley at that point. McClellan claimed Lee suggested that swinging around the Union Army might be the quickest and the most effective way for Stuart's forces to move northward. McClellan concluded his statement about this order in the post-war years, writing, quote, "The whole tenor of the letter gave evidence that the commanding general approved the proposed movement and thought that it might be productive of the best results, while the responsibility of the decision was placed on General Stuart himself." End quote. The problem with McClellan's claim about this third order arriving is that there is no physical evidence of it ever being written. When you look through Lee's logbooks, it is not there. When you look through Stuart's logs at the time, there is no record of this order ever appearing. Is it possible it was a wet, rainy night and that nobody bothered to record its reception and that the order got deluged in all the rain and all that stuff? Sure, it's possible. I doubt it. There is no evidence to indicate that that is the case. We have no hard physical evidence. And so, we have to relegate this third supposed order's arrival to fiction, because there is no evidence to support its existence. But in reality, when we look at what McClellan's supposed third order states, he doesn't state anything wrong in it. The only step that he goes even further is to drive home the point that Lee gave Stuart discretion to make the decision. The assertion that the roads were clogged west of the Blue Ridge Mountains was true. The assertion that the easiest way forward for Stuart was to circumvent the army was true. But there is no hard evidence of this order actually existing. Thus, June 23rd, another pivotal event is going to happen. Late that evening, early in the morning, as the rain starts to clear out, John Singleton Mosby arrives at Stuart's headquarters. Known as the Gray Ghost, perhaps one of the more effective scouts and cavalry soldiers of the Confederate Army throughout the course of the war, Mosby was a trusted advisor of Stuart. Stuart often looked to him to scout the enemy and to provide reports on what the enemy was up to. Mosby later wrote that, quote, "I pointed out to Stuart the opportunity to strike a damaging blow and suggested to him to cross the Blue Ridge Mountains and pass through the middle of Hooker's army into Maryland." After the war, Mosby would come out to the defense of Stuart, perhaps feeling guilty for his actions in leading Stuart to make the decision that he did. Stuart had performed, again, 2 similar rides around the Union Army before. He thinks, with the advice of his most trusted scout, John S. Mosby, that it is possible to do it again. And so on June 24th, Judge Stuart decided to take his 3 most trusted brigade commanders in his cavalry division, Fitz Lee, Wade Hampton, and Randolph Chambliss, totaling about 4,000 troopers. He leaves behind his less trusted officers, Grumble Jones, Jenkins, General Robertson, and General Imboden. These men guard the gaps and do just as Stuart's other men would have. And to even further take this to another point, the idea that the cavalry was not scouting during the Gettysburg campaign, on June 28th, the 35th Virginia Cavalry, under the Imboden's troops, reports back to Lee's headquarters that the Union Army was fast approaching up the road systems through Maryland on June 28th. That is cavalry troops, that are reporting on June 28th that the Union Army is moving up. Perhaps the scout Harrison that is famed in the movie Gettysburg plays a role in it, but he certainly was not the only one reporting back to Lee that the Union Army was fast approaching. Thus, Stuart made his decision. He felt to turn back would be risky. And so instead of passing to the rear of the Union Army, he actually passes through the Union Army. As the Union Army is moving up the road systems through Maryland, he cuts through the middle of them and starts to make his way towards Washington, D.C. What will happen in the ensuing days is plagued with bad luck from the very beginning. He's unable to leave through Thoroughfare Gap as Longstreet had directed him to, because the Union cavalry were blocking it. As a result, he had to detour 5 miles to the south and go through Glasscock's Gap. That's delaying his movement forward. Perhaps at that point he should have decided to turn back and to not commit to what he had already committed to, but he felt as though it was too late. The troopers in Stuart's command, the 4,000 troopers, literally fought every single day from the beginning of their incursion until they arrived in Gettysburg on July 2nd. Outside of Washington, D.C., they capture 150 wagons. Those 150 wagons filled with supplies for the Union Army are important supplies for Lee's army. Lee will use those supplies, but what are they going to do? The mules pulling those wagons are going to slow him down. This was anything but what one historian has termed a joyride. It was the exact opposite. Quite frankly, it was a miserable experience from beginning to end for Stuart and all of his troopers. By the end, troopers were literally falling asleep in the saddle because they had fought so long and so hard. On August 11, 1863, a correspondent from the Mobile Daily Advertiser and Register penned a scathing critique of Stuart, stating this, quote, "His vanity seems to have controlled all of his actions, and the cavalry was used frequently to gratify his personal pride and to the detriment of the service," end quote. Other historians have echoed similar criticisms. Douglas Southall Freeman, the famous Lee biographer, contended that after Brandy Station, Stuart, quote, "was humiliated more deeply than ever he had been in his campaigning," end quote, and that this diminished ego forced him to rash decisions. It does seem from the correspondence with his wife that his pride may have played a role in his decision to commit to this ride. Although this might be a fair criticism of Stuart, this does not mean that Stuart did this in direct disobedience to his commander's orders, as some wish to believe. As Lee's and Longstreet's orders on June 22nd and the 23rd demonstrate, Stuart was entirely within his given authority to do what he did. May not have made the right choice, but he was within his authority to do what he did. Historians like Alan Weslow contemptuously assert Lee's orders to cross east of the mountain did not give Stuart the authority to go for a quote-unquote joyride around the Federal Army. These historians, though, fail to recognize that every road east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which headed northward for miles, was clogged with Union troops, their supply wagons, their artillery, and their cavalry. Thus, crossing east of the Blue Ridge would by necessity require some move around the Union Army to access roads which headed north, which were not already being used by enemy forces. Does this mean Stuart has to stop by Washington, D.C. to threaten the U.S. Capitol? No, it does not. But he had to cross pretty darn far east in order to access roads running north that were not clogged with Union soldiers. And as General Longstreet made clear in his addendum to Lee's orders, Lee and his subordinates had discussed this ride around the Union Army at length, and thus Lee felt comfortable giving Stuart discretion. In addition to this, Lee's orders made it plainly clear that Stuart should, quote, be able to judge whether you can pass around their army without hindrance, doing them all the damage you can, end quote. That is precisely what Stuart did. Given the information he was given by Major John S. Mosby and other scouts, he deemed this move the most effective way to cause the Union Army maximum damage. And he certainly did. When you look at newspaper reports, the threat that he imposed upon Washington should not be underestimated. It forces me to divert troops in that direction to help protect the capital. Unfortunately for Stuart, a series of events led to the slowing down of his movements and caused him to be tardy to the Battle of Gettysburg. However, he did inflict serious damage on Union supply lines and communications, cutting telegraph lines and intercepting Union supplies. So even if Stuart arrived late, he was effective at wreaking havoc in the enemy's rear. And was this not Stuart's job, according to Lee's orders of June 22nd and 23rd? In the end, Stuart does deserve some criticism for his role in the Gettysburg campaign. It is almost certain that the ride he embarked on was risky, and ultimately the Confederates did not reap the reward of the risk that Stuart took. However, the criticism which Marshall first laid upon Stuart in 1887, and modern historians have continued to perpetuate, is patently false. The facts, when analyzed, clearly demonstrate that Stuart did precisely what his commander allowed him, or even, some would argue, encouraged him to do. Thus, Lee and his staff share the blame for Stuart being late to Gettysburg. Perhaps we should not be surprised. No wonder it was the man who wrote those orders on June 22nd and 23rd, Charles Marshall, who began this criticism of Stuart in 1887. Marshall was certainly successful at shifting attention away from his own shortcomings, if nothing else. So with that, thanks everybody. I am now ready to be yelled at, confronted. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, Jack?
Stuart was known as being quite the ladies' man.
He was.
Was he, no offense, but during the Antietam campaign, he stopped at Urbana, Maryland on September the 8th and had a big party when the New York cavalry came in and they had to break up the party. Was he doing similar things on this particular?
Not during this ride, no. And frankly, he didn't ever get the chance. The Union cavalry at this point, good, I can't do that. The Union cav, there we go, that's how we got around it, was very proficient this ride in harassing Stuart constantly. There are literally small engagements that break out every single day of the ride. Of the Union forces just harassing him the entire way. And I think that that's part of the reason why it takes Stuart by surprise. In many ways, what he does in the Peninsula campaign and the Antietam campaign happens relatively without any interference, right? He is getting interference from the very beginning on this ride. And really, frankly, when he encountered the Union pickets at Thoroughfare Gap, was it? I forget which gap it was. When he encountered those Union pickets right off the get, he probably should have made the decision then not to embark on the ride. But he decides that with the information that he has received from Mosby that he can do it. And frankly, the Union Army was not stationary. By the time he gets back down, he does that 5-mile detour. By the time he gets back up, now the Union Army's in motion. So that jump start we could have got that morning was immediately thwarted, and that sets him back right off the get. And he is fighting all the way up until July 2nd, before he arrives with Lee's army even. He's fighting up in Carlisle with Union forces up there as well. So it's a slog for him, and any of those glory days of parties and such on rides was not happening this time around. Yes?
Why did Stuart turn away from Washington, D.C.?
So,
June 28th.
yeah, great question. So when he arrives on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. on June 28th, Washington at that point is a heavily fortified city. The works, the defenses, the forts that are there in place are strong. And there are quite a large number of Union forces defending the city.
Is this before or after Ewell's attempt to attack Washington from the north?
Early's attempt in 64?
Oh, this was,
Yeah.
okay.
Early tries in 64, and Early goes north with an entire corps and cavalry reinforcements, and he can't even take the city later. And so Stuart, with 4,000 troopers, the most he could really do, he wasn't going to take the city. He put on a decent show, scared the bejeebus out of the inhabitants of Washington, D.C., but he had no real chance at capturing the city. He did not have a force sizable for that. It's a great question.
Maybe got intelligence for what happened, but
Yeah, absolutely. And along the way, right, what is he doing? He's coming across telegraph lines. Telegraph lines that are communicating what the War Department wants directly to Hooker and eventually to Meade when he takes over. Meade is largely, throughout the entire three-day battle at Gettysburg, out of communication with the War Department in D.C. They're only 7 miles away, but he's largely out of communication with them because most of those telegraph lines have been cut by Stuart's ride. So he is causing damage and he is wreaking havoc. It's just a question of whether or not he should have continued when he met resistance. Yes?
If Lee had cavalry to observe the battles of the Union forces, did he not trust the commanders of his brigades, or did he have no confidence in them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So 2 of those brigades that are left behind are still in the Blue Ridge Mountains during the battle, guarding those gaps, screening the army, making sure that the supply line is protected. The other 2 are largely in south-central Pennsylvania, and to a certain extent it is an issue of trust. To Lee, Stuart is his most trusted advisor, right? At that point, Longstreet and Stuart, with Jackson being dead, are 2 of his most trusted commanders. And Stuart takes with him his 3 best commanders, the 3 that he trusts most, and frankly, the 3 that Lee also trusts most. So there is an issue of trust happening. It's not to say that those officers and those men who were in the other 2 brigades were not reliable, were not good soldiers, but there is a degree of distrust with Lee and those commanders of those brigades. Another point that historians often make, right, is that should Stuart have taken his 3 best officers with him, or should he have left one of them with Lee that Lee would have trusted more? And that's a fair criticism, right? But Stuart wanted the best of the best with him on his ride. He was off to glory and fame, and he wanted to inflict damage with the army, so he took the 3 people he trusted most. But certainly there is an issue of trust between the reports that he's getting and the soldiers that he has. And I think that that's a critical point, right? Who is Lee missing? Lee is not missing cavalry at the Battle of Gettysburg. He is missing Stuart, his most trusted advisor, his most trusted scout, his most trusted cavalry soldier. And so it's more missing that person for the first 2 days of the fight that's critical, right? What is Lee, when we look at the reports on July 1st and July 2nd, what is Lee saying to his subordinates? Is he saying, where is my cavalry? Where's my cavalry? Where's my cavalry? He's not saying, where's my cavalry? He's saying, where's Stuart? Where's Stuart? Where's the man? He was more concerned about having the man by him than he had cavalry. He didn't have Stuart.
How many brigades usually do observation and report?
That's a great question. It depends on the time of the war, how large each one of, depending on the armies, where they were in the theaters. Certainly 4 brigades to screen the mountain gaps and to do observation is ample soldiers at that point. We're talking upwards of 5,000-6,000 troopers that Lee still had with him. That is plenty to do what he was intending to do. Which again, I think it comes down to Stuart had fewer men, but it was more the missing of Stuart than it was anything, and those trusted advisors. Mosby, another great example, right? If Stuart's feeding Lee information, well, where is Stuart getting his information from? He's getting his information from his most trusted scouts, people like Mosby. Where are they? They're not with Lee in south central Pennsylvania on July 1st when the battle breaks out. Yes,
During your presentation, you mentioned Fredericktown,
Fredericktown, yep,
not Frederick, Maryland.
correct. Fredericktown.
Where is Fredericktown?
I want to say West Virginia. I don't think it's on the map.
Okay, all right.
I want to say it's West Virginia. It's not on the map. It's west of the Blue Ridge.
Everything you presented tonight, to me, as I interpret it, is Stewart trying to accomplish everything that he was ordered to do. He encountered difficulties getting around. He made a foray to Washington, got all these mules and supplies that he was trying to bring back to Lee. I cannot believe that he would have disobeyed orders. I don't believe that the generals, the officer corps around Lee, the kind of reverence they felt for him was purposefully disobeyed. West Point graduates don't disobey orders. And I think he's getting a bad bum rap during the years of the lost cause.
I agree. I totally agree with all of that, but he is a West Point officer. He's one of Lee's most trusted advisors. I think the key here, and similar to if we want to talk about later instances in the Battle of Gettysburg, this comes up again and again with Lee. Lee trusts his subordinates. Perhaps he gives too much trust to some of them, but he trusts them, and he gives them that discretion. And so I don't think, when you read those orders, right, when you read what Lee is writing about in the after-action report, he is giving Stewart discretion, and he's operating within that discretion that was given to him by his commander. And operating under discretion from your commander, if you make the right or wrong decision, that does not mean that you're disobeying his orders. And so I 100% agree with that assertion. There are many historians who will refute that and who will argue that point, but that certainly is the major thrust behind this presentation, was that idea that, yes?
Lee was notorious in providing orders that were seemingly imprecise, because he trusted his subordinates so well. He could just sort of shrug and stonewall Jackson and know exactly what he meant by that.
Right.
And accomplish achieve the results they wanted.
Yep, and certainly the more the war goes on, and as more trusted commanders are dying off, it becomes more and more difficult to give those discretionary orders, right? Jackson dies, Longstreet gets wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness, Stewart dies in '64. Absolutely.
I think there are some who would like to say that, yeah, here's someone who disobeyed Lee, so Lee must not be as great a general as I think he proved to be.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly where the lost cause mythology plays into this. People like Early, people like Marshall and all that, they're trying to over-glorify the man at the expense of those who cannot defend themselves. And if I'm to give you a reason why I even was interested in this, is not because I'm a fan of Jeb Stuart particularly, like, okay, he was a good cavalry officer, great, don't have a poster of him up on my wall or anything. But I think that it is important that a lot of these myths, a lot of these legends that have been perpetuated through the years by mainstream historians, it's important to sometimes question those and refute those arguments. Especially, not that his honor is a big deal to me, but I don't think that it's fair, the rap that he gets as a result of his involvement in the Gettysburg campaign. And it has a lot to do with people like Jubal Early, who I have I won't say hatred for, but a strong dislike for. So, any other questions or comments? Dawn's giving me faces. Can you not hear me well?
I can hear you fine. We should probably wrap this up.
Sounds good. Our next meeting is February 22nd at 7 p.m. Same place, same time, different day. We will have Dr. Megan Kate Nelson joining us once again. All of you who have been around for a while know Dr. Nelson is a fantastic speaker, always brings insightful presentations, so we look forward to that. She's talking about her new book on Yellowstone, right? So that'll be fascinating, slightly tangentially related to the Civil War, but I'm looking forward to it. And then a reminder again on Tuesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. we have that partnership event with the New Bedford Historical Society. It'll be on Zoom about William Jackson. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. Thanks everybody, have a good night.